Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Mark Davis wasn't the type of man to fall for easy promises. At 23, he was facing an impossible situation. His father's debts weighed heavily on him, and his dream of becoming a successful lawyer was slipping further out of reach. Every day, he carried the weight of his family's past, struggling to make ends meet. His part-time job barely paid the bills, and the pressure was mounting. That was when Eleanor Brooks, a woman of extraordinary wealth and mystery, stepped into his life. It started with an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Davis." The voice on the other end was smooth and confident. "I know about your financial situation. I can help you. Let's meet." Mark frowned, uncertain of how someone could know so much about him. He hadn't asked for help. He was too proud to admit he needed it. But when the woman insisted, he couldn't help but feel a strange pull. A week later, he found himself sitting across from her at Brooks Bistro, a luxury restaurant he could never afford on his own. Eleanor, dressed in a sharp black suit, looked every bit the part of a powerful businesswoman. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her eyes carried a confidence Mark couldn't help but admire. "You're struggling, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And I have a solution for you." Mark hesitated. What kind of solution? He had no idea where this conversation was going, but the desperation in his heart made him listen. With a brief pause, Eleanor dropped the bombshell. "Marry me." Mark blinked, unsure he heard her correctly. "Excuse me. This isn't about romance," Eleanor continued. "It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off your debts, secure your future, and in exchange, you'll be my husband. It's simple. A contract marriage. You can walk away whenever you like." Mark sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. "Why me? Why would you want to marry a stranger?" Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love. I need a companion, someone who can share my name and help me secure my legacy." He sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. This wasn't the life he imagined for himself. But then again, what was his alternative? Losing everything? Struggling to survive each day? He looked down at his hands, calloused and worn from years of hard work. He didn't have much, but he had his pride. Still, what was the price of pride if it meant losing everything? After a long pause, Mark finally spoke. "I'll do it." Eleanor's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who knew she had won the first battle of their agreement. "Good," she said, and the deal was sealed. A week later, Mark stood in front of a judge, exchanging vows with a woman he barely knew. It was a simple ceremony, cold, sterile, and devoid of any emotion. He could hardly believe what he was doing, but he did it. He had no choice. As the ceremony ended, Eleanor turned to him with a look that seemed to say, "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." Mark followed her out of the courthouse, his mind in a haze. Was this really his life now? A marriage without love, an arrangement that made him a pawn in someone else's game? His doubts lingered, but one thing was clear. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The days following their marriage were a whirlwind. Mark moved into Eleanor's sprawling mansion, a place that felt more like a museum than a home. The walls were adorned with priceless art, the floors gleamed with polished marble, and the air smelled of wealth. Yet despite the grandeur, he couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger in his own life. He knew what Eleanor wanted, a companion, a man who would play the part of a husband without asking questions. But Mark wasn't sure he could stay silent forever. What if he started to care? What if this fake marriage began to feel real? Mark wasn't sure of much, but he knew this. He was about to discover that his new life, though born of a contract, would change him in ways he never expected. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Mark Davis wasn't the type of man to fall for easy promises. At 23, he was facing an impossible situation. His father's debts weighed heavily on him, and his dream of becoming a successful lawyer was slipping further out of reach. Every day, he carried the weight of his family's past, struggling to make ends meet. His part-time job barely paid the bills, and the pressure was mounting. That was when Eleanor Brooks, a woman of extraordinary wealth and mystery, stepped into his life. It started with an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Davis." The voice on the other end was smooth and confident. "I know about your financial situation. I can help you. Let's meet." Mark frowned, uncertain of how someone could know so much about him. He hadn't asked for help. He was too proud to admit he needed it. But when the woman insisted, he couldn't help but feel a strange pull. A week later, he found himself sitting across from her at Brooks Bistro, a luxury restaurant he could never afford on his own. Eleanor, dressed in a sharp black suit, looked every bit the part of a powerful businesswoman. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her eyes carried a confidence Mark couldn't help but admire. "You're struggling, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And I have a solution for you." Mark hesitated. What kind of solution? He had no idea where this conversation was going, but the desperation in his heart made him listen. With a brief pause, Eleanor dropped the bombshell. "Marry me." Mark blinked, unsure he heard her correctly. "Excuse me. This isn't about romance," Eleanor continued. "It's a business arrangement. I'll pay off your debts, secure your future, and in exchange, you'll be my husband. It's simple. A contract marriage. You can walk away whenever you like." Mark sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. "Why me? Why? Would you want to marry a stranger?" Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love. I need a companion, someone who can share my name and help me secure my legacy." He sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. What's the catch? He thought. What was he even agreeing to? After a long pause, Mark finally spoke. "I'll do it." Eleanor's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who knew she had won the first battle of their agreement. "Good," she said, and the deal was sealed. A week later, Mark stood in front of a judge, exchanging vows with a woman he barely knew. It was a simple ceremony, cold, sterile, and devoid of any emotion. He could hardly believe what he was doing, but he did it. He had no choice. As the ceremony ended, Eleanor turned to him with a look that seemed to say, "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis." Mark followed her out of the courthouse, his mind in a haze. Was this really his life now? A marriage without love, an arrangement that made him a pawn in someone else's game? His doubts lingered, but one thing was clear. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The days following their marriage were a whirlwind. Mark moved into Eleanor's sprawling mansion, a place that felt more like a museum than a home. The walls were adorned with priceless art, the floors gleamed with polished marble, and the air smelled of wealth. Yet despite the grandeur, he couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger in his own life. He knew what Eleanor wanted, a companion, a man who would play the part of a husband without asking questions. But Mark wasn't sure he could stay silent forever. What if he started to care? What if this fake marriage began to feel real? Mark wasn't sure of much, but he knew this. He was about to discover that his new life, though born of a contract, would change him in ways he never expected. The following morning, Mark woke up in a bed that felt too big for him. The luxury of the room surrounded him like an unfamiliar cocoon. His eyes wandered across the massive space, deep velvet curtains hanging over large windows, dark wood furniture, gleaming under soft lights, and a large, opulent rug that seemed to take up half of the floor. It was nothing like his old cramped apartment. This was a world he didn't belong to, and yet, here he was. A part of him wanted to leave, to pack his things and walk out that door, but another part of him, the part that still clung to the fear of losing everything, couldn't make himself leave. His life had just become a contract, one that tied him to a woman he barely knew. As he dragged himself out of bed, the weight of the previous day's events settled on his shoulders. He had married Eleanor, not for love, but for security, for the promise of a future that didn't involve losing his family's home or drowning in debt. He had signed those papers without fully understanding what they meant, and now, every part of this strange new life felt foreign. As he walked across the room, He noticed a small piece of paper on the desk by the window. It was a note from Eleanor. "Breakfast is at 8 a.m. Don't be late." It was simple, direct, and it made him feel more like a pawn than a husband. Mark wasn't sure what to expect from breakfast with Eleanor. He had no idea how they were supposed to act around each other, especially since their marriage was more of a business deal than anything else. He'd heard rumors about her, a woman of power, control, and ambition. But now, as he prepared to meet her for the first time as her husband, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of woman she truly was. He dressed quickly, throwing on a simple suit, though he couldn't shake the discomfort of not belonging in such fine clothes. The fabric was expensive, the cut perfect, but the way it felt against his skin was unsettling. He was used to wearing hand-me-downs, worn clothes that didn't draw attention. This, however, felt like a costume, a mask he had to wear to fit in. When he made his way down the long hallway and into the dining room, he was greeted by a lavish spread. Eleanor was already sitting at the head of the table, looking as poised and controlled as ever. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her sharp eyes focused on a document in front of her. She didn't look up as he entered, but he could feel her gaze on him, even if it was hidden behind the papers she was reading. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm and commanding, as if they had known each other for years. "Please sit." He took a seat across from her, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. It was hard to believe that less than 24 hours ago, they had exchanged vows in a cold courthouse, both of them pretending to be something they weren't. Mark tried to focus on the food in front of him, fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the contract marriage they had entered. It felt more like a transaction than anything else. "So," Eleanor began, breaking the silence, "I assume you've had time to think over the arrangement." Mark's stomach tightened. "I have," he replied cautiously, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that morning. "And I'm still not sure how to feel about it." "That's understandable," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she set down her pen. "But you will come to understand the benefits in time. There's no need for us to pretend this is anything more than what it is. A partnership, a practical solution to both our problems." Mark didn't know whether he should be relieved or unsettled by her directness. "And what about you? What do you want from this?" Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. "I want security. I want control of my legacy. I want someone who will stand by my side in public, someone who will help me secure my future without questioning me." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need love, Mr. Davis. I need a companion. And you, whether you like it or not, are it." Mark stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. It wasn't a romantic notion, but it was brutally honest. And, for better or worse, he couldn't argue with that. He had agreed to this arrangement for the same reason: survival, security. It wasn't about love, but he could already feel a tiny crack in his resolve. "So what now?" Mark asked, still unsure about his next move. "What do I do here?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Now," she said with a calculated calmness, "you start learning your role. We have an image to maintain. You'll accompany me to social events, business meetings, and any occasion that requires a husband. There's no need for affection, but there will be expectations of you, and you will meet them." Mark nodded slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but it seemed he had no other choice. This was his life now, a life built on a contract, and Eleanor was right about one thing: it would change everything. As he sat there, staring at the untouched food on his plate, Mark realized that he had no idea where this path would lead. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. Days passed, and Mark found himself becoming more accustomed to the strange new world he had entered. He was still living in Eleanor's mansion, still married to a woman he barely knew, but the awkwardness between them had started to fade. He attended business meetings with her, stood by her side at social events, and played the role of a perfect husband in public. However, in private, they were still strangers, bound only by a contract. Mark went through the motions, but something inside him was starting to shift. Eleanor was no longer just the woman who had saved him from his debts. She was someone he was beginning to understand, and perhaps even admire. It wasn't love, at least, not yet, but there were moments. Small moments when Eleanor let her guard down, moments that made Mark question the motives behind their arrangement. He saw how hard she worked, how she carried herself with confidence and authority, yet there were times when he caught glimpses of vulnerability. Her smile, though usually controlled, was softer at times, and her eyes, though cold, sometimes held a hint of something deeper. One evening, Mark was walking down the long hallway of the mansion when he overheard Eleanor on the phone in her office. Her voice was low, but he could hear the frustration and the exhaustion in it. He hesitated at the door, not wanting to intrude, but curiosity got the better of him. As he leaned against the wall, he heard her speaking to someone. Her lawyer, he guessed. "I don't care what it costs," she said sharply. "I want this taken care of. I've worked too hard to let it all fall apart now." Mark couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but it was clear that there was more to Eleanor than he had originally thought. She wasn't just a powerful businesswoman. She was someone who had been through her own battles, someone who was fighting to protect everything she had built. The next morning, as they sat down for breakfast, Mark found himself looking at her differently. She was still the same Eleanor, poised and untouchable, but now he saw the layers behind her tough exterior. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. Eleanor, however, noticed his change in demeanor. "You're staring," she said, looking up from her coffee with a raised eyebrow. Mark quickly looked away, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Sorry, I was just thinking. You never really talk about why you do all of this." He gestured to the expansive mansion, the lavish lifestyle she had created. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't seem offended. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "I've had to fight for everything I have, Mark. People have tried to tear me down, steal what's mine. This house, my company, everything I've built, is my legacy. I won't let anyone take that from me, not even you." Her tone was firm, but there was something raw about it, something that hinted at the pain she'd endured to get here. Mark nodded, sensing the depth of her words. "I get it. But what if it's not just about legacy? What if you're trying to prove something to yourself, not just everyone else?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Eleanor's gaze flickered, her expression hardening for a moment before she responded. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Not anymore." She paused, then added in a quieter voice, "At least, that's what I tell myself." Mark couldn't help but wonder if she was lying to herself. He didn't know the full story, but he could feel there was something more beneath the surface. And for the first time, he felt a pang of sympathy for her. They were both trapped in this arrangement, each with their own reasons for staying. But Mark realized that he wasn't just here for the security anymore. There was something deeper at play. Days turned into weeks, and though their marriage remained a business arrangement, the dynamic between them started to shift. They spent more time together outside of business functions, and Mark found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected. He told her about his past, about his father's debts, about his struggles to survive. She listened, but didn't offer much in return. Still, there was an unspoken understanding growing between them. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights, Eleanor spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "You know, when I married you, I didn't expect this, whatever this is. I thought it would be simple. A transaction. But it's not, is it?" She looked out over the city, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lights below. Mark didn't know how to respond, but he felt the weight of her words. He had thought the same thing when he agreed to this marriage. But now, as he sat beside her, he realized that he wasn't just playing a role anymore. There was something more here, and it scared him. "No," Mark finally said, "it's not simple. It never was." And as they sat there in the silence, Mark couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep pretending. How long they could keep playing the part of a perfect couple when the truth of their feelings was starting to surface. For the first time since their marriage began, Mark felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected to find. Something real. As the days went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between him and Eleanor. It had started out as a simple arrangement, married on paper, no love, no attachment. But now, the lines were beginning to blur. They had been attending more events together, business functions where they had to act like a couple, but the small moments they shared when the world wasn't watching felt more genuine. Eleanor wasn't just the woman who had saved him from drowning in debt. She was someone he had started to respect, even admire. And with each passing day, he felt himself drawn closer to her in ways he hadn't expected. Mark was still hesitant, though. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, but he was afraid of what it meant. He had told himself from the beginning that this marriage was about security, about survival. But now, he was starting to wonder if there could be something more. Could he really fall in love with her? Was that even possible, given their circumstances? One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Eleanor suggested they take a break and have dinner at the mansion. Mark agreed, though he knew it wasn't going to be a casual meal. Eleanor always made everything feel like it had a purpose, even something as simple as dinner. They sat at the large dining table, the room quiet except for the sound of the soft music playing in the background. It was moments like this that made Mark feel like a part of her world, but at the same time, like he was still an outsider. As they ate, Eleanor spoke, her voice steady but with a hint of something deeper, something more vulnerable. You know, this arrangement, it's starting to feel less like a business deal and more like a real partnership, she said, looking at him across the table. Mark looked up, surprised. He wasn't sure if she was just talking about the marriage in general, or if she was referring to something more personal. Mark hesitated for a moment, his fork still in his hand. I feel the same way, he said slowly, his voice quiet. But I'm still not sure what this is, Eleanor. What happens if we start caring about each other? What happens if this isn't just a contract anymore? He put his fork down and looked at her, searching her face for any sign of how she felt. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, her eyes moving away from his as she thought. Mark waited, the tension growing between them. Finally, she spoke, her words slow and deliberate. Mark's heart raced as he heard the honesty in her words. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear her say that. It felt like an acknowledgement, not just of the arrangement they had made, but of something deeper they had both been fighting to ignore. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt like he was seeing the real Eleanor. The woman who had built an empire, who had controlled every aspect of her life, was showing him a side of herself that wasn't just about business or legacy. It was a side that craved something more, something real. He reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was small, but it felt like it held more meaning than anything they had shared before. Eleanor looked down at their hands, her expression softening. She didn't pull away, and Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. They were still pretending, yes, but maybe, just maybe, they were also starting to build something real. They sat there in silence for a moment, neither of them willing to break the quiet. Mark could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. He knew they weren't at the end of this journey yet, but something had changed. Eleanor wasn't just the woman he had married for security. She had become something more, something he hadn't expected to find in this arrangement. As they finished their meal, the air between them was different, lighter somehow. Mark wasn't sure what the future held for them, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the same page. They weren't just playing roles anymore. They were partners, in more ways than one. It wasn't love yet, but maybe it could be. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Eleanor and Mark had reached an unspoken understanding, but the air between them was still thick with uncertainty. Mark was still unsure where this would lead, but he couldn't ignore the way things were changing. It had started with small gestures, a glance, a smile, and now, it felt like their lives were slowly becoming more intertwined. Eleanor wasn't just the woman who had married him for a business arrangement. She was becoming someone he cared about, someone he thought about when they weren't together. Mark spent more time with her outside of business meetings now. They'd have dinner together in the evenings, or occasionally go out for a walk around the sprawling grounds of her estate. Eleanor still maintained a sense of control, a distance that Mark couldn't fully break through, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when she would let her guard down. He had started to realize that this woman, the one who appeared so composed, so confident in everything she did, was hiding parts of herself. She wasn't as invincible as she seemed. It was one of those moments, late one evening, when Mark saw it. They were sitting in the drawing room, talking about work, when Eleanor's hand suddenly stopped mid-motion. She had been gesturing as she explained something, but now she looked lost in thought. Mark paused, his gaze lingering on her. "Eleanor," he asked softly, "are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. For a moment, she seemed to be considering something, thinking deeply about something she hadn't shared. Then, she slowly placed her glass of wine down, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. But Mark noticed the slight crack in her tone. Mark didn't push. He had learned by now that Eleanor wasn't someone who liked to open up easily. But there was something about her vulnerability that pulled at him. "You don't have to hide it from me," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Whatever it is, you don't have to do it alone." For a moment, Eleanor was silent, her eyes meeting his. He could see the walls she had carefully built around herself. But for just a second, he saw a crack in the armor. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice small, as if confessing something she hadn't dared to admit. "I didn't want to need anyone. I didn't want to depend on anyone." Mark felt his heart tighten. He could understand that feeling all too well. He, too, had been independent for so long, carrying the weight of his family's debts alone. But something about this moment made him realize that perhaps they weren't so different after all. They were both just trying to survive in a world that demanded so much from them. Eleanor shook her head as if trying to brush away the vulnerability she had just revealed. "This marriage, this arrangement, it was supposed to be a business deal. I thought if I kept everything about it practical, I wouldn't have to feel anything. But now," she trailed off, her voice losing its usual strength. "Now, I'm not so sure." Mark reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. The gesture was simple, but it felt like a turning point. He had never thought that a contract marriage could lead to this connection, this understanding. "I get it," he said softly. "I didn't expect this either, but it's happening. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay to not have everything figured out right now." Eleanor met his gaze, her lips curving into a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She squeezed his hand in return, her grip firm, yet tender. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it is okay." They sat there for a long moment, neither of them saying anything more, but their shared silence spoke volumes. Mark couldn't help but feel like something had shifted between them. They were no longer just playing roles, husband and wife on paper. They were beginning to become something real. And for the first time since this strange marriage had begun, Mark wondered if there could be a future for them beyond the contract. The next few days were filled with more quiet conversations, more small moments where Mark and Eleanor shared pieces of themselves with each other. It wasn't love, not yet, but it felt like something that could grow. Their connection deepened, and though Mark still didn't know where this would lead, he realized he didn't need to have all the answers. He just needed to be present in the moment. And right now, the moment felt like it was just beginning to turn into something more. As Mark lay in bed that night, thinking about the events of the day, he found himself finally at peace with the uncertainty. Maybe they were still pretending in some ways, but in others, they were starting to build something real. And that, he thought, was more than he had ever hoped for when he first walked into this strange arrangement. Tomorrow, he knew, would come with its own challenges, but for now, Mark allowed himself to feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. As the weeks went by, the change between Mark and Eleanor was undeniable. Their conversations had become more open, more personal. They were no longer just playing their roles for the public eye. The lines between their contract and their reality were starting to blur. Mark had always been cautious, unsure of where this was leading, but now, he couldn't ignore the growing connection between them. Eleanor had always been in control, but there were moments, quiet and fleeting, where she let down her walls. And in those moments, Mark saw the woman behind the power, the vulnerability, the weight of everything she had carried for so long. It was a Wednesday evening when things shifted again. They had just returned from a high-profile charity event, and as usual, they were expected to play the part of the perfect couple. Mark had learned the routine by now: smile, be charming, and never let anyone see the cracks beneath the surface. Eleanor had been the picture of grace all night, but when they returned to the mansion, something was different. She seemed distant, lost in her thoughts. Mark followed her into the living room, where she stood by the fireplace, her back to him. "Eleanor?" he asked, his voice gentle, not wanting to intrude but sensing something was off. She didn't turn around immediately. There was a long pause before she finally spoke, her voice low, almost fragile. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up." She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "This facade, this perfect image, it's exhausting. Sometimes, I wonder if it's even worth it. But then I think about everything I've built, and I know I can't let it all fall apart." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the life she had created. Mark took a step forward, his heart going out to her. He knew the pressures she faced. He had seen the way she worked, the way she carried herself with so much strength, but now he saw the cracks in her armor. For the first time, he felt like she was letting him see the real her, the one who was tired, who had been carrying the world on her shoulders for so long. "You don't have to do this alone," Mark said softly, his voice steady. "I'm here. Whatever this marriage is, whatever we've become, this isn't just a contract for me anymore. I care about you, Eleanor, and I'm not going anywhere." He didn't know where those words had come from, but once they were out, he knew they were true. He had never imagined himself in this position, but here he was, telling the woman he had married for survival that he cared for her. Eleanor's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't pull away. For a moment, she remained silent, as though considering his words. Then, she slowly turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. There was something raw in her gaze, something that took Mark's breath away. "I don't know if I can believe that," she said quietly. "It's hard to let anyone in, Mark, especially after everything I've been through. But for the first time, I'm starting to believe that maybe this is real. Maybe we could be something more." Her voice trailed off, uncertainty lacing her words. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer to her. He reached out, his hand gently brushing hers. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. We don't need to know what the future holds. But I'm here, for you. And if that's enough for now, then that's enough for me." His words were simple, but they felt like a promise. For a long moment, they stood there, silently understanding the weight of what had just been said. The air between them felt different now, charged with something neither of them had been willing to acknowledge before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something more than they had ever expected from this arrangement. As Eleanor slowly nodded, Mark could see the tiniest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know that she was beginning to let go of the walls she had spent years building around herself. Later that night, as Mark lay in bed, he couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. They had come so far in such a short amount of time. What had started as a business transaction, a marriage of convenience, was now something deeper. He didn't know if it would ever turn into love, but for the first time, he was okay with the uncertainty. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was living in a reality that, for better or worse, he was starting to share with Eleanor. He turned onto his side, his thoughts drifting as he heard the faint sound of footsteps from the hallway. Eleanor, perhaps, still up late, dealing with the endless responsibilities that came with her life. But tonight, there was something different. He felt hopeful, and as he closed his eyes, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The next few weeks seemed to pass in a blur for Mark and Eleanor. Despite the growing closeness between them, things were still far from simple. The dynamics of their marriage, though changing, were complicated by the demands of Eleanor's business and social responsibilities. They had both begun to accept that this partnership, this contract marriage, had evolved into something more, something neither of them had anticipated. But even with that realization, they knew the real test was yet to come. Eleanor had kept her distance from him emotionally for so long, and Mark wasn't sure how much further they could push past the walls she had built around herself. It was one afternoon, at a charity gala that had been meticulously planned by Eleanor's company, that the truth came to light. Mark had been growing more comfortable in his role as Eleanor's husband, but the evening's events revealed the cracks in their still-developing relationship. As the night wore on, they were surrounded by high-profile guests, and Mark did his best to play the part of the perfect husband, charming, attentive, and silent when needed. But something was different tonight. Eleanor, usually so poised, seemed distracted. Her usual confidence was replaced with something darker, a hint of unease that Mark couldn't ignore. He watched her from across the room, standing by the grand staircase, her eyes scanning the crowd, but her focus was elsewhere. When she finally turned to him, her expression was tight, her smile forced. Mark knew something was wrong. He excused himself from the group he was with and approached her. "Eleanor," he said gently, reaching for her arm. "What's going on? You seem off tonight." Her eyes met his for a split second, and he saw the hesitation there, the uncertainty she had kept hidden behind her strong facade. She took a deep breath before answering, her voice low but sharp. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Mark. This image, this life, it's too much." Her words hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he'd heard her correctly. What do you mean? Mark asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. We've been doing fine. We've made it work, Eleanor. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. He stepped closer to her, his hand finding hers. She pulled her hand away slightly, the space between them growing. You don't understand, she said, her eyes distant now. I've spent so long trying to control everything, to keep it all together. But tonight, I can't keep pretending. I'm not the person everyone thinks I am. I'm not invincible. I'm scared, Mark. Her voice faltered for the first time, and Mark felt his chest tighten. The truth hung between them, raw and unspoken. It was the first time Eleanor had shown such vulnerability, and it startled him. For all her strength, for all the power she wielded, she was still human, still afraid of losing everything she had worked so hard to build. Mark didn't hesitate this time. He reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers with a quiet assurance. You don't have to be invincible. Not with me. You don't have to do this alone anymore. We're in this together. All of it. The good, the bad, everything. His words were simple, but they felt like a promise. Eleanor's eyes softened, a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, passing through her gaze. She swallowed hard, nodding slowly. For the first time, she didn't pull away from him. She didn't try to keep up the mask. They stood there, together, as the world continued to spin around them. As the night went on, things felt different between them. The walls between them had shifted, even if only slightly, and for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to lean on Mark. It wasn't love yet, not the kind that could overcome everything, but it was a beginning. And that was enough for now. When they finally left the gala, the weight of the evening settled between them. Mark could feel the shift, the change in how they viewed each other. The contract had always been the foundation of their marriage, but now it was something more, a commitment to each other, not just to the promises they had made. As they walked to the car, Mark turned to Eleanor, his voice softer than before. We don't have to have it all figured out, but we'll figure it out together. She looked at him, a smile playing on her lips, a silent agreement passing between them. They didn't need to have all the answers yet, but they were willing to find them. For the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he wasn't just going through the motions. He was part of something real. Weeks passed, and the dynamic between Mark and Eleanor continued to evolve. What had started as a business arrangement, a contract forged out of necessity, was now something far more complicated. Mark had begun to see Eleanor in a new light, no longer just the powerful CEO who had saved him from financial ruin, but a woman with vulnerabilities, someone he had come to care about deeply. For Eleanor, the shift was just as profound. The walls she had built around herself, the emotional distance she had maintained for years, were slowly crumbling. She had let Mark in, more than she had ever intended, and it frightened her. But as the days passed, she couldn't deny the comfort he brought. The truth was, she hadn't expected to find someone like him in this arrangement. Someone who understood, who didn't expect her to be perfect all the time. One evening, after a long day of meetings and charity events, Mark and Eleanor found themselves alone in the mansion once more. The world outside had faded, leaving them in the quiet of their home. Mark sat on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine, while Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. There was a sense of calm in the air, but also an undercurrent of something unsaid between them. Do you ever wonder what this all means? Eleanor's voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. Mark looked up from the magazine, meeting her gaze. What do you mean? She turned to face him, her expression serious. I mean us. This marriage. This arrangement. I know we've been getting closer, but do you think we're just fooling ourselves? Or is this real? Mark's heart raced at her words. It was a question he had been avoiding himself, but hearing it come from her made him realize just how much had changed between them. I don't know, he said, his voice honest. But I know that I care about you, Eleanor. More than I ever thought I would. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, her expression softening. I don't know what this is, either. But I feel like we've moved past the point of pretending. It's no longer just a contract to me. It's something more. But I'm scared, Mark. Scared of what could happen if we really let ourselves feel something for each other. Mark stood up and walked over to her, closing the distance between them. I'm scared too, he admitted, his voice quiet but steady. But I think that's what makes it real. We're not pretending anymore. We're both here, in this, for real. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just need to trust each other. Eleanor's eyes glistened, a tear threatening to fall, but she held it back. She looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty in her gaze. I don't know if I can do this, but maybe I'm ready to try. Mark reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. I'm here, Eleanor. We're in this together, no matter what. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, the weight of their shared silence speaking volumes. And then, slowly, Eleanor nodded, a small, tentative smile forming on her lips. Okay, she whispered. Let's see where this goes. Mark smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't love yet, but it was something real. And for the first time in their marriage, he felt like they were finally on the same page. They didn't need to have all the answers, but they were ready to face whatever came next together. As they stood there in the quiet of the room, Mark realized that this was the moment when everything changed. Their marriage had started as a contract, a deal made out of necessity. But now, it had the potential to become something deeper, something that neither of them could have expected. And for the first time, he believed it could be enough. The weeks that followed felt like a new chapter in Mark and Eleanor's life together. The shift between them had been gradual, but now it was undeniable. They had stopped pretending. Their marriage, which had started as a business arrangement, was slowly turning into something more. They were no longer just two people living under the same roof. They were partners, in every sense of the word. Mark could feel it in the way they spoke to each other, the way they shared moments of vulnerability and strength. Eleanor, the woman who had once seemed so untouchable, had let him in, and Mark had done the same. They weren't just playing roles anymore. They were building something real. It was a rainy afternoon when Mark decided to take the next step. He had been thinking about it for weeks, but now, standing in the hallway of their mansion, he knew it was time. Eleanor was in her study, working as usual. She had always been the driven one, the one who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. But Mark had seen the cracks in her armor, and he knew she was more than just a woman with an empire. She was someone who deserved more than to carry that weight alone. He walked to her study and knocked lightly on the door. Eleanor looked up, surprised to see him standing there. Mark? She asked, her voice soft. What is it? Mark smiled and stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. I was thinking, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. We've come a long way, haven't we? From where we started to now. This partnership, this marriage, it's become more than I ever thought it could be. He paused, watching her closely. Eleanor's eyes softened as she listened, her gaze never leaving his. And I want to take it further, Mark continued, his voice filled with sincerity. I know this started as a business arrangement, but I'm not here because of the money. I'm here because of you, Eleanor. I care about you, and I'm not afraid to say that anymore. He took a deep breath, his nerves bubbling up. So I want to ask you something. Will you give us a real chance? Will you make this more than just a contract? I want us to build something together, something that's ours. For real. Eleanor stood up slowly, her eyes wide, as though processing his words. For a moment, she didn't speak, and Mark felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. Maybe he had said too much. Maybe she wasn't ready. But then, Eleanor took a step toward him, her eyes softening. Mark, she said quietly, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to be here, with you, feeling the way I do. But I'm not going to pretend anymore. I know what this is. I care about you too. More than I ever thought I could. She smiled gently, the weight in her eyes lifting. So yes, let's build something real. Together. Mark's heart swelled as he reached out to take her hand. For the first time in their marriage, he felt the connection between them solidify into something unshakable. This was no longer just an arrangement. It was their life, their future. As they stood there hand in hand, Eleanor leaned in and kissed him gently on the cheek. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. They had come so far, and there was still a long road ahead of them. But for the first time, they both knew they were ready for whatever came next. Mark looked at her, a smile tugging at his lips. We're in this together, right? He asked, his voice full of warmth. Eleanor's smile matched his, her hand still holding his firmly. Together, she replied, her voice soft but certain. And in that moment, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. Their contract had turned into something deeper, something real. They were no longer bound by just paper, but by the trust, the understanding, and the love they had started to build. No matter what challenges they faced ahead, they would face them together. As they walked out of the study, hand in hand, Mark couldn't help but think how far they had come. What had started as a simple contract, a solution to their problems, had turned into something far more beautiful than he ever expected. And as they moved forward, he knew one thing for sure. Their story was only just beginning.